All right, once again.
Hello and welcome to This Movie Stinks. I am your host, Brandon Moeller. Thank you for joining me. Please do remember that on this channel, all reviews are spoiler reviews. Today I'm going to be talking about Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare, or A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 6. Now normally, when a horror film, and especially if it's a slasher, uses the word final in their subtitle, it's total bullshit. I'm thinking about Friday the 13th, that actually pulled that twice and then still made more movies. But in this case, New Line was serious. For whatever reason, they didn't want to make any more Freddy films. And I don't completely understand that choice, because even though the box office numbers had dropped between 4 and 5, for instance, they were still making money. The budgets for these movies are really small. You don't have to get name actors. New Line could have pumped out a couple more of these, made, I don't know, 20, 30 million more dollars before shutting it down, but this is the choice they made. So what do we have here with Freddy's Dead? I would say not a lot. There's a lot about this movie that makes it seem like it exists completely outside of the rest of the series. I would say primarily the look and feel of this movie make it feel totally incongruous with what came before. For instance, the earlier films, even the bad sequels, were still very 80s. There was a lightheartedness about it, even though it's a horror film, and you're still a little bit scared, but it's a fun ride, it's a popcorn movie. But all of that's gone now with Freddy's Dead. The whole movie is so ugly and dour and grimy. Everything is this really horrible color palette. Everything looks like Freddy's sweater. Everything is just shades of brown and red and green, and every scene in this film is just messy. Every room is cluttered, piled high with papers, writing on the wall. It's just a really ugly film. And during this particular viewing, all this stuff got me thinking about one of my favorite bands from the 80s, Oingo Boingo, who started out being this really exuberant, quirky, funny, funky new wave band, but then as the 90s approached, they got very serious, their music stopped being fun, it got political and very introspective, which is fine, but it didn't really suit that band. And I feel like that's a pretty good comparison to how this series of films went. This is our first look at Freddy and A Nightmare on Elm Street in the 1990s, and it's just so artificially grimy. They really want you to know when the movie takes place. They really want to distance themselves from that 80s feel, and I think that's a huge mistake. Now, normally with a finale movie like this, you're going to get a character returning or some element from a previous movie returning, something that's going to really tie the whole series together, make it feel complete. That doesn't really happen here. I was trying to think of a character who could come back, but I'm thinking like, okay, everyone from Nightmare 1 is dead, right? I mean, even John Saxon got killed in Part 3, so I guess that's out of the picture. Even though they do bring Johnny Depp back for a pointless, this is your brain on drugs joke.
Questions?
Oh, you could bring back Jessie and that Meryl Streep looking girl from Part 2, but I don't think anyone wants to revisit Part 2, do they? So in lieu of having a popular character to bring back for this one, they give Freddy a daughter. That's right, Lisa Zane turns out to be Freddy's daughter, Catherine. I feel like normally with a retcon of that kind, that this new information is now what's going to be used to defeat the villain, which is not the case here. It's an interesting revelation, but not one that's very useful to the plot. I suppose you could look at it and say, okay, well, a Kruger can finally kill a Kruger, that's the difference. But it's not overtly stated, at least that's not my memory of it. Oh, and Yaphet Kotto's in this! From Alien, Mr. Big. This movie does not deserve him, nor do they really use him.
I'm barely being paid.
For the most part, he's only in these really brief exposition scenes where we learn that he's a dream doctor and he's counseling Lisa Zane through her own chronic nightmares. It's also where we're introduced to this idea of dream demons, which actually does come back in the climax of this movie. But for the most part, he's useless, which is a shame because he's the only good actor in this whole movie. Yeah, I suppose I should mention that there's another new group of teens for Freddy to fuck with, and they're easily the worst this series has to offer. No chemistry, bad performances. It makes me want those dummies from Part 5 back. I'm not going to go into the plot of this movie because honestly it doesn't matter. Everything's tied together by coincidence and really quick exposition. I guess I haven't talked much about Freddy because there's really not a lot to say. He's never been less scary. His jokes have never been worse.
I'll get you, my pretty, and your little soul too.
His makeup has never been worse. It's very clearly thick latex. It no longer looks like burn effects. At this point, the character is so famous, and Robert Englund is so famous for portraying him, that you're really just watching the actor. The character has pretty much disappeared. And was this movie sponsored by Nintendo?
Now I'm playing with power.
Nintendo, now you're playing with power.
There's that whole video game scene with Spencer, which just looks like an episode of Nick Arcade.
Down under the vulture, great. Staying low from the flies. All right, here's one gem.
I know this is not an original observation, but this movie is so Looney Tunes. And it's distracting, because you've got this really ugly, grungy movie that's supposed to be sort of like a 90s crime drama, and then you're filling it with all these totally goofy gags. There's a real disconnect in tone. And the writing here is lazy to the point where they either forgot the rules of how the nightmare stuff work, or they don't care. They're just choosing to do things that are convenient to moving everything along. Like in the scene where Freddy's fucking with Spencer, Lisa Zane can see the abyss that opens up below the stairs. Freddy is able to jump into Lisa Zane while she's awake. And then near the end, when they bring Freddy into the real world, he's climbing up on the ceiling. I mean, I'm not stressing about these things because honestly they do not matter, but it would have been nice for this final film for the writers to show a little discipline. And I guess I was being a little unfair earlier when I said that this movie does not bring in enough elements from previous films, because the climax of this is actually really similar to the first movie, where they pull Freddy out of a dream. And I guess at least this time around, someone actually physically fights Freddy to the end, instead of just turning their back and saying, "Oh, I don't believe in you." But this fight between Freddy and Lisa Zane is so dull. There's no tension here. It doesn't even feel like there are any stakes, because these two characters just met. Like, this revelation that she is his daughter just happened. At this point in the Nightmare series, we've seen a lot of final girls duke it out with Freddy at the very end, and this is easily the worst one. I'm really just wanting it to be over, and then when it is over, I can't believe the ghost snakes that fly out of Freddy's head. And even in 1991, with your 3D glasses on in the theater, this had to be a horrible, laughable effect. And they spent a lot of money doing this. The budget for this movie was $5 million more than the last one, and the effects in this look awful. So anyway, Freddy's defeated by his daughter. She blows him up with a pipe bomb that was very haphazardly introduced earlier in the film, and that's it. The closing credits treat us to a greatest hits reel, and that's the end of the series. Freddy's Dead is one of those slasher films where I wish it were worse, so that it would either be so bad it's good, funny, or that I could get really riled up about it and pissed off and then rant, but neither of those things really apply. It's a really bland movie, it's badly acted, it's directionless, there's nothing fun to it. As kooky as Freddy is being in this movie, it's just tiresome. I can't even enjoy the gags. Definitely the worst Nightmare on Elm Street film of the whole series. Not a fitting send-off for Freddy. Not a satisfying conclusion to this series. This series has actually been pretty strong up to this point. Even the Dream Child is looking pretty good right now. So, Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. 1/2 star for Robert Englund, 1/2 star for Nick Arcade, and that's it. 1 star. It's a bad movie, folks.